Well, I think there's a lot for philosophy to do. um, it's also the case that philosophy survives as a discipline, as a formal or an official kind of part of universities, as its own department usually, and as its own section in bookstores and so on. So that raised the question of, well, what is it that philosophy today does? And that brings us to our third main topic, the contemporary meaning of philosophy. So what I want to do is sketch out for you four possible answers to this question of what philosophy is today. So the first answer is that whenever an inquiry or a field becomes particularly general, fundamental, synoptic, evaluative, or controversial, it becomes philosophy. So what we could see there is that when physicists, say quantum physicists, argue about how the data in quantum mechanics, the experiments and the experimental results, should be interpreted. That is, what should we say reality is like if quantum phenomena operates in the way that it seems to according to experiments? What should we conclude from that? They begin to enter into arguments with one another, and they are no longer able to answer their questions about that by using the methods that are canonical methods in physics. They start needing to reflect on fundamental assumptions about what they're doing. They need to reflect on like the fundamental principles of the discipline of physics itself and what those fundamental principles should or shouldn't be. And when they do that, then they start to do philosophy. And what we see is that people who are engaged in those discussions in physics, if you look at where they publish their theoretical contributions, they're often citing philosophers, arguing with philosophers, and philosophers likewise are citing physicists and arguing with them. So there starts to be a kind of convergence or a place where the questions can't be addressed by the canonical physics methods, the sort of standard physics methods of experiment and reflection on the experiments, and there starts to need to be more reflection and a dealing with questions that are more controversial, and that brings the field to the border of philosophy, and there starts to be something more philosophical going on in the discussion. Another possible answer is that philosophy is the field that deals with questions that can't uncontroversially be answered in other fields. So if we look at like the history of physics and the history of psychology, as we saw, they kind of branched off from philosophy when they started to develop methods for addressing their questions that were relatively agreed upon within the communities in question, of the communities of researchers in question. But there still are a lot of questions that can't, that don't, where there isn't an established community of inquirers that have agreed upon how to address them, or at least the question can reasonably be raised as to what would be the best method to use for addressing them. And so you think, for instance, about morality, questions about what's the difference between the right and the wrong thing to do, or the best way to behave versus not so good ways to behave. What kinds of societies should we strive for? All these questions about evaluative issues, big, large-scale evaluative issues. What should we do? What's better and worse? Those are examples of questions that really don't have any kind of science that can address them at present. It's even unclear. It's hard for us even to imagine what would count as a science adequate to addressing them. So since those remain controversial questions, they remain questions that are typically or sort of it makes sense to address within philosophy or by philosophical means. So the idea there is that philosophy is left with, after all these other disciplines branch off, philosophy is left with the questions that we still don't have a good research program, a single research program for answering. And so we still need to strive for wisdom regarding them, even if we don't know exactly how to acquire it. So we still need to be lovers of wisdom, pursuers of wisdom, even if we don't know exactly what the best way is to acquire that wisdom. And so we're still doing philosophy about those things. A third possible answer is that all of these different fields actually are still philosophy. They're just philosophy conducted under certain assumptions about methods. So this way of reading things, which is probably not going to be agreed to by very many people besides professional philosophers, possibly, and even not all of them for sure. But you could say that physics is still philosophy. It's still the pursuit of wisdom. It's just the pursuit of wisdom about the fundamental nature of physical reality conducted through a set of very refined techniques. And when physicists make arguments that we should see the world a particular way, and they refer to their own experimental findings as part of the evidence for that, they're doing something that's continuous with what the ancient Greeks were doing, and even some of the philosophers we'll read in class were doing. They're just doing it with these like very refined methods, and taking on or accepting certain assumptions about what the best way to conduct the inquiry is.